If you watch any of those extreme wilderness survival shows on television today, there's always a very specific formula. You take a person, you strip away their modern conveniences, and you just drop them into this brutal, unforgiving environment.
Right, but there's a catch we almost always ignore with those shows.
Yeah, exactly. Even the most helpless contestant possesses this immense baseline of inherited human knowledge. I mean, they know what fire is, even if they struggle to start one. They know the basic geometric concept of a shelter.
And they know things like water needing to be boiled to kill pathogens, even if they can't see them.
Exactly. But what happens when you strip away even that baseline? Like, what happens when the perfect environment is stripped away and a species is left to navigate a hostile, broken world with absolutely zero precedent, zero historical knowledge, and zero accumulated generational wisdom?
I mean, it's the ultimate survival scenario, but the stakes are literally the survival of the human race itself. We are talking about the raw, unfiltered reality of two individuals waking up in a world they were never biologically or spiritually designed to inhabit in this way.
Welcome back to Between the Verses, where curiosity meets scripture. I'm Daniel Moreau.
And I'm Hannah Moreau.
And this is the official first deep dive of our second series titled Between the Verses, the beginning of humanity outside Eden.
Yeah, and just to give you some context, this deep dive is a direct continuation of our previous journey. In our first series, Unpacking the Beginning, we went through Genesis chapters 1 through 3. We looked at the mechanics of creation, the whole ecosystem of Eden, and, the specific anatomy of the rebellion that caused the exile in the first place.
So if you haven't heard that first series, we strongly encourage you to go back and listen to it on YouTube and Spotify. You really won't regret it. It's going to bring you totally up to speed and provide the foundation for everything we're building on today.
And just as a reminder for how we do things here, everything we're discussing today comes directly from our individual reading, our notes, and our study of the text.
Yeah, the core mission of this show is to encourage the Bible to be real in your life, rather than just viewing it as, an old book of ancient scrolls. I mean, think about it. These ancient scrolls have survived millennia. If that's not God's hand at work, we really don't know what is.
We really don't. So our mission today is to take the plunge right into Genesis chapter 4. The theological heights of Eden are gone, and we are descending into the gritty dirt of early human civilization.
And our deep dive begins at the exact, precise, physical moment that chapter 3 ends. Adam and Eve are walking away from the garden, and God stations cherubim at the entrance to block the way back.
Right, and if you grew up in Sunday school, you probably picture cherubim as, chubby little babies with wings playing harps.
Oh, totally. The Renaissance painting version.
Yeah, but the ancient Near Eastern context of a cherub is entirely different, completely different. The ancient Israelites and the surrounding cultures, like the Assyrians and Babylonians, they understood cherubim as these terrifying composite guardian figures.
Like those massive statues you see in museums.
Exactly. Think of the winged sphinxes or the Lamassu statues guarding ancient palaces. These were formidable, imposing spiritual beings of immense power, stationed specifically to guard sacred spaces from unauthorized intrusion.
So we have these terrifying guardian beings holding flaming swords, completely sealing off the only home humanity has ever known. And I want you to look at this from the perspective of those angels for a second.
Oh, that's a fascinating angle.
Yeah, think about a completely sterile, highly secure biological laboratory. Up until this exact moment in history, these angelic beings have only ever known the abstract theory of the equation. Disobedience equals death.
Right, because they've only existed in perfect harmony and divine order.
Exactly. But now the containment of that laboratory has been breached.
The lab analogy works really well as a starting point, but the reality is even more staggering because those angels weren't just, scientists observing a petri dish. They were spiritual beings deeply invested in the cosmic order.
Yeah.
The whole concept of death, of physical degradation, of emotional agony, those were entirely abstract theological concepts to them. A warning issued by the Creator, sure, but never a physical reality they had actually witnessed.
Because literally nothing had ever died before.
Precisely. And now they are forced to learn in real time, right alongside humanity. The consequences of sin are no longer abstract. They are vividly unfolding in the physical realm right in front of them.
Wow, yeah.
They're seeing the emotional devastation on the faces of Adam and Eve. They're witnessing the first ripples of entropy, decay, and suffering entering the physical universe.
It completely reorients how we read that transition from Genesis 3 to 4. I mean, this isn't just a sad human survival story. It's a cosmic tragedy playing out on a universal stage before a captive audience of spiritual beings. They are watching the flawless masterpiece of creation just fracture.
It adds this immense, heavy psychological weight to the moment.
It really does. And what strikes me as we move into chapter 4 is this massive, unrecorded gap in the text, right as they leave the gates. I mean, Genesis gives us no indication of how much time passes between Adam and Eve walking into the wilderness and the conception of their first child, Cain.
Right. The biblical narrative is just silent on the exact duration there. It could have been months of desperate struggle or, could have been years of trial and error. The text doesn't specify because its primary focus is theological progression, not a daily chronological diary.
But contemplating that gap is so vital to understanding the trauma of their exile. For you as the listener, we have to zoom in on that gap because they had to figure out basic survival completely from scratch.
Absolutely.
I'm talking about the friction of the physical universe suddenly fighting against them. Like, how do you know how to build a fire to stay warm when your body has only ever known a perfectly calibrated, idyllic climate?
You don't.
Right. How do you know how to construct a shelter that won't collapse on you in a storm when you've never experienced severe weather? Every single action, finding food that wouldn't poison them, fashioning crude tools out of rocks, learning to weave plant fibers for warmth, it all required immense, exhausting cognitive and physical labor.
You're hitting on the thermodynamics of a cursed earth there. The environment just no longer cooperated. Every time Adam tried to cultivate the ground and his hands were shredded by newly grown thorns, it wasn't just physical pain.
No, it was a reminder.
Exactly. It was a visceral psychological trigger reminding him of what he threw away. The labor was a daily, hourly consequence of their rebellion.
But even as they are outside fighting the dirt just to stay alive, the text forces us to look back at the gates for a moment. There are these lingering mysteries about what they left behind on the inside. Let's look at the tree of life for a second.
Okay, yeah.
In Genesis 3:22, God says now, in order that he may not put his hand out and take fruit also from the tree of life and eat and live forever, and then he evicts them. I read this and I feel like I'm reading about someone who lived in a mansion their entire life. And only on the day the bank forecloses and kicks them out do they learn there was a safe with $1 billion hidden in the basement.
That's a great way to picture it.
Right. Did Adam and Eve even know the tree of life was there?
It's honestly one of the most fascinating questions in the early chapters of Genesis, and analyzing the text mechanics reveals something pretty surprising. Prior to the fall, the Bible never records God giving humanity any specific instructions, warnings, or even an introduction to the tree of life.
That's so wild to think about.
It is. God's explicit command was hyper-focused on the restriction regarding the tree of the knowledge of good and bad.
And the serpent never uses the tree of life as bait either.
Right.
Like Satan doesn't say, hey, go eat from the tree of life first, become immortal, and then eat the forbidden fruit.
He doesn't, which suggests the tree of life wasn't really part of humanity's immediate conscious paradigm, or at least it wasn't the focal point of their existence. Our sources indicate a strong possibility that its true function was a mystery to them, perhaps known only to God and his heavenly court.
Wow.
But regardless of whether they knew about it, God's reaction in verse 22 completely reframes the eviction.
Right, because if they possess this new, corrupted, sinful nature, the absolute worst-case scenario for the universe is for them to wander back into the garden, eat from the tree of life, and immortalize their brokenness.
Exactly. They'd be locked into a permanent eternal state of suffering and separation from the Creator.
So the cherubim at the gate aren't just there to punish. They are a profound mechanism of divine mercy. God is actively preventing humanity from trapping themselves in an eternal hell on earth.
The eviction is a rescue mission. And in that same verse, God makes a statement that has sparked centuries of theological debate. He says, "The man has become like one of us, knowing good and bad." The critical word there is us.
So who exactly is the us?
Well, our source material lays out the two primary scholarly perspectives on this, and we really need to look at both to understand the complexity of ancient biblical Hebrew. The first perspective argues that God is addressing his heavenly court, that divine council of angelic beings we just talked about.
Right, the audience.
Exactly. We see this concept of a divine council elsewhere in ancient Near Eastern literature and later in the Hebrew Bible, like in the book of Job or the Psalms, where God is depicted presiding over an assembly of spiritual beings. So in this view, God is simply speaking to his heavenly audience, pointing out that humanity has crossed a boundary.
Okay, that makes sense. And what's the second view?
The second view points toward the plural nature of God himself. The Hebrew word for God used heavily in Genesis 1 is Elohim, which is grammatically plural. While the verbs associated with Elohim are usually singular, indicating one God acting, the plural noun hints at a complexity within the divine nature. Many view this us as an early veiled seed of the doctrine of the Trinity, or at least a plurality of majesty within the one God, which obviously becomes much more fully developed in the later biblical texts.
And we don't need to force one interpretation to obliterate the other today. The beauty of this deep dive is allowing the text to maintain its ancient tension. It invites us to think critically without forcing an unnatural certainty where the text clearly leaves room for mystery.
Absolutely.
But speaking of things the text reveals subtly, we have to talk about Eve's name. This is a detail I skipped over for years. In chapter 2, and the vast majority of chapter 3, she doesn't have a name. She is strictly referred to as the woman.
The Hebrew text is very intentional about this. She is not given the proper name Eve, which in Hebrew is Hava, rooted in the word for life or living, until Genesis 3:20a. The timing of this naming is honestly one of the most profound moments of human resilience in the entire Bible.
Because it happens after the fall. It happens after God has explicitly looked them in the eye and introduced the concept of physical death, telling them they will return to the dust. The inescapable reality of their future is the grave.
Right.
And Adam's immediate response to hearing that humanity is doomed to die is to look at his wife and name her the mother of everyone living. It's just insanely ironic.
It is ironic, but it's driven by a radical theological anchor. Think about the psychological devastation they're experiencing. They've lost paradise, they are cursed, and they are mortal. Yet Adam names her Hava. Why? Because he's clinging desperately to the promise God embedded within the curse just a few verses prior.
The promise about the offspring.
Exactly. God promised that the offspring of the woman would eventually crush the head of the serpent. Adam is planting his flag on that promise. He is declaring, right in the face of total cosmic disaster, that life will somehow continue through her.
He believes the human story isn't over. But the sheer terror of what that title, Mother of All Living, actually requires of her is about to become a brutal reality. Because to be the mother of the living, she has to navigate the very first pregnancy in the history of the human race. And this brings us into the wild, terrifying firsts of humanity.
Genesis chapter 4 opens with this stark reality. It says, "Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain."
I want to stop and force us to really process the biological and psychological reality of this moment. I said earlier that survival show contestants have a baseline of knowledge. Eve had none. Zero.
Absolutely none.
She had no mother, no grandmother, no midwife to consult. There were no previous generations of women to tell her, yes, the morning sickness is normal. Yes, the kicking you feel inside your abdomen is a baby growing, not a parasite. She's trapped in a completely unmapped biological war zone, and she has to endure it entirely blind.
And we must factor in the specific parameters of the curse from Genesis 3 here. God told her, "I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children."
Oh, man, yeah.
She knows intellectually that this process is tied directly to her rebellion, and she knows it's going to involve immense suffering. But she has no physiological frame of reference for what that pain will actually feel like, how intense it will become, or how she's supposed to survive it.
The psychological terror of those 9 months must have been suffocating for her. And then the event itself begins. Let's look at Adam's role, or rather, his profound helplessness.
Adam is watching the woman he loves, the literal flesh of his flesh, rising in unimaginable agony. And he possesses absolutely no medical knowledge.
None.
He doesn't know how to deliver a child. He doesn't know if the sheer volume of blood means she's dying. He doesn't know if the child is stuck. There's literally no one to run to for help. The isolation of their exile peaks in this moment.
That's so heavy.
It is. The traumatic screams of childbirth echoing in the uncultivated wilderness, it represents survival at its most visceral, raw, and terrifying level.
It really strips away the sterile, sanitized way we usually read the Bible. This was traumatic. This was the physical manifestation of sin tearing through the human body for the first time. But she survives. The baby survives. And they name him Cain.
But the birth is just the beginning.
Right, because now they have an infant to keep alive in a hostile environment, which brings us to the relentless burden of Adam's labor.
Adam was placed in the garden to work it and keep it, so he understood the fundamental concepts of agriculture. He understood seeds, growth, and harvest. But inside Eden, the environment was perfectly calibrated to respond to his stewardship. Outside Eden, the ecology is entirely fractured.
The earth actively resists him now.
Exactly. The text emphasizes thorns and thistles. This implies a brutal thermodynamic shift. Adam now has to expend massive amounts of caloric energy just to prepare the soil, fight off aggressive invasive weeds, and try to coax a meager harvest from dirt that is cursed.
Just to get a few calories.
Right. The sheer volume of time required to simply secure enough food to keep himself, a nursing mother, and an infant alive means they were locked into a brutal cycle of survival.
Which raises an interesting ecological question. When Adam goes out to clear a field and encounters this wild environment, were there animals already out there? Like, did the animals get kicked out of Eden with them, or was the world outside already populated?
Based on the scope of the creation account in Genesis 1 and 2, the text strongly indicates the world outside another. Eden was already teeming with animal life. Remember, God created the animals and told them to multiply across the earth. Then, God specifically planted the Garden of Eden in a distinct geographical location in the east.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, Eden was a highly concentrated, localized sanctuary of perfect order.
So the rest of the planet wasn't a dead wasteland, it just wasn't Eden. It was wild, untamed nature.
Correct. The original divine mandate given to humanity was to fill the earth and subdue it. The overarching theological implication is that Adam and Eve were supposed to take the borders of Eden and push them outward. They were meant to partner with God to gradually expand that cultivated, perfectly ordered paradise until it enveloped the entire globe.
That is a staggering paradigm shift for how you read the story. The entire planet was waiting for humanity to bring the order of Eden to it. But because of the rebellion, sin didn't just corrupt the human soul, it basically aborted the geographic expansion of paradise.
That's exactly it.
Instead of bringing order to the wild earth, they brought the chaos and death of their own fracture right into it.
And that fracture accelerates rapidly. As we continue through the text, Cain grows up, and Eve has a second son, Abel. And as these two brothers step into adulthood, we see the mutation of the human heart fully manifest. This brings us to the divergence of two paths and the very first offerings.
The text tells us that Cain becomes a worker of the ground, taking over his father's grueling agricultural labor. Abel takes a different path and becomes a keeper of sheep. I want to pause on the timeline here, because Genesis compresses time heavily.
Yeah.
Because of the vast lifespans recorded in early Genesis, the age gap between Cain and Abel is a complete unknown.
Right, we just don't know.
They could be a year apart, or there could be decades between them.
Given the longevity of early humanity, it's entirely possible Cain was the sole focus of his parents' attention for 20, 30, or 50 years before Abel was born. If Cain operated as an only child for decades, only to suddenly have to share the limited resources and parental affection with a younger brother, it provides a fascinating psychological foundation for the profound jealousy that erupts later.
Oh, wow. Yeah, the ultimate older sibling rivalry.
Yeah.
Regardless of the age gap, they both eventually reach a point where they bring offerings to God. And this is a monumental moment in the narrative. Think about the implications. It proves that despite the eviction, God did not completely withdraw his presence from humanity.
No, he didn't.
There was still a designated place or method of approaching the Creator. And it proves that Adam and Eve successfully transmitted the knowledge of God to their children. They taught their sons the necessity of worship.
The mechanics of ancient Near Eastern worship are critical to understand here, too. An offering, or a sacrifice, was a physical mechanism for maintaining a relationship with the divine. It was an acknowledgement of dependence, gratitude, and submission.
But the outcome of these specific offerings is what drives the rest of human history. God accepts Abel's offering, but he rejects Cain's. Now, I have to stop here and clear up a massive misconception.
Let's hear it.
I've heard my entire life, in countless sermons and Sunday school classes, that the reason God rejected Cain's offering is because Cain brought rotten, leftover vegetables. The narrative is always that Cain basically swept up the garbage from his harvest floor and threw it on an altar. Does the text actually say that?
It absolutely does not, and we have to be extremely precise with our source material here. Genesis never states that Cain's produce was rotten or spoiled. The text simply says, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground.
So it's just very neutral.
It's a very generic, matter-of-fact description. However, the writer of Genesis draws a very sharp, intentional contrast with how Abel's offering is described. The text says, Abel brought the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions.
Let's unpack the fat portions because, well, to a modern reader, trimming the fat is what you do when you want a leaner, cheaper cut of meat.
Right, for us, it's the part you throw away.
Exactly. But in ancient times, that meant something totally different.
In the ancient Near Eastern context, and specifically in the later Levitical sacrificial system that this text anticipates, the fat, the haleb in Hebrew, was considered the absolute richest, most luxurious, and vital part of the animal. It represented the premium, highest quality component. Furthermore, Abel didn't just bring any sheep, he brought the firstborn.
Which is a huge deal.
It required immense faith. By sacrificing the very first offspring, you are trusting God to provide the rest of the flock. You're giving away the guarantee of your future livelihood.
So the contrast isn't good meat versus rotten vegetables. The contrast is the posture of the heart. Abel brought a sacrifice of absolute excellence and trust. He gave God his first and his best. Cain simply brought an offering of obligation. He just checked the religious box. God requires crops, here are some crops.
Exactly. The physical offering was merely a diagnostic indicator of the internal spiritual condition. God, who sees the heart, recognized the lack of reverence and faith in Cain's offering and rejected it. But what is truly remarkable is God's response to Cain's subsequent anger.
Right. Cain's face falls. He is furious. And God doesn't just vaporize him for his bad attitude. God actually initiates a conversation. He speaks directly to Cain. This tells us that outside of Eden, the overlap between heaven and earth hadn't completely vanished yet. Direct, audible communication from God was still happening.
And God issues a profound psychological and spiritual warning. He says, why are you angry and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it.
Sin is crouching at the door. That language is incredibly visceral. It sounds like a predator.
The Hebrew word used for crouching is robes. In ancient Mesopotamian literature, a rabasu was a specific type of lurking demon or supernatural beast that ambushed people at thresholds or doorways. The text is personifying sin not just as a bad habit, but as an active, predatory entity waiting to completely devour Cain.
Wow.
God is offering him a clear, divine off-ramp. He's telling Cain, you have a choice. You can master this emotion or it will consume you.
And this leads us to the most tragic mutation in human history. The anatomy of the first murder. Cain ignores the creator of the universe, and the virus of sin that started in the garden mutates with terrifying speed. Think about it. Satan's pride and jealousy over God's authority led to his rebellion. That exact same spiritual pathogen crossed the species barrier, infected Adam and Eve, and now in exactly one generation, it escalates from eating forbidden fruit to cold-blooded fratricide.
The devolution of Cain's heart is meticulous, and our sources emphasize the calculated nature of the crime. This was not a hunting accident in the woods. It was not a tragic casualty of a broader tribal conflict. It wasn't an act of self-defense that went too far. It was premeditated, weaponized jealousy.
Verse 8 says, Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him.
The invitation to the field is a masterclass in betrayal. Abel trusted his older brother. Why wouldn't he? They were the only two brothers on the planet. Cain intentionally isolated Abel, drawing him away from the proximity of their parents, away from any possibility of intervention, and he slaughtered him.
Go back to our angels at the gates of Eden for a second. The unseen audience. Imagine the horror radiating through the spiritual realm in that moment.
Yeah.
I mean, they had seen the humans evicted, yes. They had seen the animals die for the first clothing. But they had never seen a human being intentionally extinguish the life of another human being out of sheer spite. The containment breach is now total.
And the immediate aftermath demonstrates how completely the human conscience has shattered. God approaches Cain and asks a simple diagnostic question, much like he asked Adam in the garden. He says, "Where is Abel, your brother?"
And Cain delivers the first recorded lie in human history. He says, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?"
We really need to analyze the sheer breathtaking audacity of that response. It is not just a defensive lie blurted out in a moment of panic. It's dripping with sarcasm, arrogance, and deep contempt.
He's talking to Yahweh, the omnipresent, omniscient creator of the cosmos. And Cain's heart is so severely calcified by his own sin that he essentially rolls his eyes at God. He lies to God's face and then mocks the concept of familial responsibility. Am I his babysitter?
The word keeper or guardian carries immense covenantal weight. Families were designed to be the primary structure of protection. Cain didn't just fail to keep his brother, he became the ultimate anti-keeper. He destroyed him. And his flippant response proves that once the boundary of taking a human life is crossed, the boundary of lying to the divine means absolutely nothing.
But wait, how does God actually respond to this? Because this isn't just a father scolding a kid for stealing a toy. This is the ultimate judge of the universe facing a cold-blooded murderer who is currently mocking him. The scales of cosmic justice demand blood. This brings us to the profound complexity of how God balances justice and mercy in the subsequent expansion of humanity.
God's response is an intricate display of divine justice. He says, "The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground, and now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand."
The poetry of this punishment is devastating. Cain was a master cultivator. His entire identity, his daily routine, his expertise, it was all intrinsically tied to the soil. That was his domain of mastery. God's punishment strikes at the very core of who Cain is. God says the ground will no longer yield its strength to him.
It's the ultimate vocational excommunication.
Exactly. I think of it like taking a master concert pianist, someone whose entire existence and self-worth revolves around the creation of music, and permanently severing their auditory nerve. You haven't executed them, but you have fundamentally removed their ability to interact with the very thing that gave their life structure and meaning. Cain is sentenced to be a wanderer, a fugitive, permanently severed from the agricultural security he once commanded.
But here is where we see the profound duality of God's character. God perfectly executes justice by stripping Cain of his vocation and condemning him to wander, but simultaneously, he extends unmerited compassion. Because Cain's immediate reaction is pure panic, he cries out, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Whoever finds me will kill me."
He suddenly cares about the sanctity of life, now that it's his own life on the line.
Right.
But God doesn't say, "Good, you deserve to be hunted down." God actually puts a mark on Cain and promises a sevenfold vengeance on anyone who kills him. God protects the first murderer.
God's discipline is calculated and purposeful. It's never impulsive or purely vindictive. Even in the face of absolute defiance, God maintains his sovereignty over life and death, refusing to let human society immediately devolve into a cycle of vigilante blood feuds.
Okay, I have to stop you here because this is the part where modern readers cringe, and we really have to address the elephant in the room. Cain says, "Whoever finds me will kill me." And then a few verses later, he has a wife. I feel like I'm stepping on a landmine here, but we have to address the incest. Where did this wife come from, and who is he afraid of if the only people on earth are Adam, Eve, and him?
It's arguably the most frequently asked question regarding the early chapters of Genesis, and we must address it using the biological and textual parameters of our sources. First, the text of Genesis 5 explicitly confirms that Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters. The narrative only highlights Cain, Abel, and later Seth because they are the central figures driving the theological storyline.
So there's an expanding population that the text just glosses over in the background.
Yes. Therefore, early in human history, Cain's wife was undeniably a sister or perhaps a niece, depending on the timeline.
But biologically, culturally, how do we reconcile that with the fact that it sounds horrific to us today?
We have to understand the genetics of the origin point. This scenario was entirely unique to the absolute beginning of humanity descending from one single genetically pristine family unit. Today, incest is biologically disastrous because of the accumulated genetic load, the mutations and defects in human DNA that occur over thousands of generations.
Right.
When close relatives reproduce today, those recessive mutations align and cause severe deformities. But at the dawn of humanity, the genetic pool was fresh and uncorrupted by millennia of entropy. The biological risks we associate with incest simply did not exist yet.
So the temporary practical necessity to fulfill the mandate to multiply.
Precisely. And our sources clarify that much later in biblical history, specifically under the Mosaic Law in Leviticus, these types of marriages between close relatives were strictly, explicitly prohibited by God once the population had expanded and genetic degradation had occurred. Today, there is zero biological or biblical justification for it. But in Genesis 4, it was the only mathematical way a single origin family could expand.
That makes biological sense, but brings up another issue, the way Genesis handles time. Verses 16 and 17 give you absolute temporal whiplash. Listen to this sequence. Cain leaves the presence of God. Then he knew his wife. Then she conceives and bears Enoch. Then Cain builds a city and names it after his son.
It sounds incredibly fast.
Right. If you read that with a modern Western mindset, it sounds like Cain walked out of God's presence, found a wife, had a baby, and stacked enough bricks to build a metropolis all by the end of the week.
This is a critical principle for interpreting ancient Near Eastern texts. Our source material points out that the biblical writers regularly and intentionally compress decades, or even centuries, into a few brief verses. They were not writing a day-by-day historical diary. They were curating the most important technological, genealogical, and theological milestones.
So building of the city wasn't an overnight construction project. We're zooming out to a massive temporal scale. We're watching generations multiply, time passing, and human civilization expanding.
Exactly, and this leads us into the final and perhaps most complex section of our deep dive, the explosive rise of civilization and the simultaneous catastrophic fall of human morality.
I am endlessly fascinated by the incredible paradox right here in the text. The very first murderer in the history of the human race is also the architect of the very first city. Cain, who is cursed to be a wanderer, actively defies that curse by stopping, settling down, and building a fortified settlement. It perfectly demonstrates that immense human brilliance and profound human evil can perfectly coexist in the exact same heart.
It's the dual track of early humanity. Rapid technological progress running parallel to rapid moral decay. If we track the lineage of Cain as laid out in the text, we see an absolute explosion in human innovation. The text highlights specific descendants who become the fathers of various industries.
Right, Jabal becomes the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. So we have the invention of complex, nomadic agricultural economics. Jubal becomes the father of all those who play the lyre and pipe. Humanity invents music, art, and culture. But the one that really staggers me is Tubal-Cain. The text says he was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron.
This is a monumental leap. We are talking about the dawn of metallurgy.
Let's really think about the mechanics of metallurgy. You don't just stumble into smelting iron. To extract usable metal from raw ore, you have to build furnaces capable of reaching sustained temperatures of over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. You have to invent bellows to force oxygen into the fire. You have to understand the chemical properties of mixing copper and tin to create bronze. The intellect required to conceptualize and execute this process is staggering. From a purely anthropological standpoint, Cain's family line consists of absolute geniuses. They are mastering the physical universe.
They are building a robust, highly advanced society. But concurrently, on that second track, their moral framework is plummeting into the abyss. The text introduces us to a descendant of Cain in the 7th generation named Lamech, and he's a terrifying figure who institutionalizes the sin of his ancestor.
First of all, Lamech is the first recorded polygamist. He takes 2 wives, Ada and Zillah. He completely corrupts the original design of marriage, 2 becoming one flesh that God established in Eden. He treats women as property to be accumulated.
But the corruption goes much deeper than polygamy. Lamech isn't just a violent man, he is a man who glorifies his violence through art. The text records a poem he speaks to his wives. It's often called the Song of the Sword, and it is the very first recorded poetry in human history.
Wow.
He says, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold.
Let's break down the sheer arrogance of this poem. Lamech takes the divine grace that God extended to Cain, the promise of 7-fold protection to prevent blood feuds, and he twists it into a license for exponential, unrestrained brutality.
Notice the disproportionate nature of his violence, too. Cain killed his brother out of deep, simmering jealousy over a rejected sacrifice, and then Cain tried to hide it in shame. Lamech kills a young man simply for striking or wounding him. A minor physical altercation is met with lethal force, and he doesn't hide it, he writes a hit song about it and demands his wives listen to him brag.
It's a horrifying flex. He is essentially saying, I don't need God's protection. I have Tubal-Cain's bronze swords. If anyone touches me, I will eradicate them and their entire family.
Lamech embodies unchecked pride, total arrogance, and the institutionalization of violence. It proves a devastating point about the human condition. Technological advancement did absolutely nothing to fix the human heart. The invention of bronze and iron didn't make them more peaceful. It only provided them with sharper, more efficient tools to butcher each other.
Man, that's dark.
Yeah, in just a few generations, humanity has used its immense God-given intellect to build a society entirely predicated on power and bloodshed.
That is a brutally heavy realization. If Genesis 4 ended with Lamech flexing his bronze weapons and his 2 wives, it would be the most depressing, hopeless text ever written. But the biblical narrative never lets the darkness have the final word. There is a thread of redemption that the text weaves back in right at the very end of the chapter. The camera cuts away from the dark, violent, smog-filled city of Cain's descendants, and it pans all the way back to Adam and Eve.
Genesis 4.25 notes the birth of another son to Adam and Eve. His name is Seth.
And Eve specifically views Seth as a divine replacement for the son she lost. She says, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him.
This is a crucial pivot in the biblical narrative. From this point forward, the text essentially ignores Cain's incredibly accomplished, highly technological, yet completely morally bankrupt family line. It leaves them in their city and focuses exclusively on the lineage of Seth, because Seth's line is the lineage that will carry the story of redemption forward.
The promised seed of the woman from Genesis 3, the one who will eventually crush the serpent, is going to be preserved through Seth. And we see the immediate, profound spiritual impact of this family line in the very last verse of the chapter. Seth has a son named Enosh, and the text gives us this massive illuminating detail. It says, at that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord.
We really have to examine the word Lord here. In almost every English translation, you'll see Lord printed in all capital letters. Our source material points out that this is a long-standing translation tradition used to represent the sacred four-letter Hebrew name of God, the Tetragrammaton. YHWH, often pronounced Yahweh. This isn't a generic title for a deity. This is God's personal, relational, covenant-keeping name.
But what exactly does it mean that they began to call on it? Because we just established that Cain and Abel were bringing offerings to God earlier in the chapter. Hadn't humanity been praying before this?
Our sources present two primary views on how to interpret this phrase impartially. The first view suggests that this marks the beginning of organized, formal, public worship using God's personal name. Up until this point, worship, like the offerings of Cain and Abel, was highly individualized and family-based. With the birth of Enosh, the population has expanded enough that worship is transitioning into a communal, public liturgy. They're gathering together to publicly proclaim the name of Yahweh.
Okay, I can see that. A community of faith formally organizing itself. What's the alternative view?
The second view interprets this as a profound, desperate spiritual revival. Think about the cultural context. The world is rapidly becoming dominated by the violence, arrogance, and self-sufficiency of Cain's descendants. Men like Lamech are trusting in their bronze swords and their fortified cities. In stark contrast, Seth's line realizes their total vulnerability and spiritual weakness. So they begin to loudly, desperately, and publicly call out to Yahweh for help and deliverance.
It's the ultimate contrast. Cain's line says, we will build a city and forge weapons to protect ourselves. Seth's line says, we are defenseless and we must rely entirely on the Creator. Whichever view you take, it is undeniably a massive spiritual milestone. In the incredibly dark, violent landscape of early humanity, a light turns on. The community of God begins to actively navigate a fallen world by clinging to the covenant name of God.
It's the genesis of faith operating in a hostile environment.
We have covered an unbelievable amount of ground today. Let's just summarize the sheer volume of monumental firsts we unpacked in this single chapter. We witnessed the terror of the very first childbirth and the grueling friction of the first agriculture. We saw the first acts of worship outside Eden, the lethal mutation of jealousy. We examined the anatomy of the first murder and the arrogance of the first human lie to God's face. We trapped the building of the first city, the brilliant invention of music and metallurgy, and the horrifying composition of the first poem, glorifying violence.
It completely reframes how we view this text. Genesis 4 isn't just a simple morality tale about two brothers who couldn't get along. It is the gritty, deeply realistic, incredibly complex blueprint of humanity trying to establish civilization in a world without paradise.
And the reason this matters so deeply to you, the listener, is because we are still living in that exact same tension today. Look at the modern world. Look in the mirror. We are capable of staggering brilliance. We cure genetic diseases. We engineer artificial intelligence. We split the atom, and we send rovers to photograph Mars. We possess all the immense God-given creative DNA of Jubal and Tubal-Cain.
Right.
But simultaneously, we constantly wrestle with the exact same dark, predatory impulses of jealousy, pride, and violence that derailed Cain and corrupted Lamech.
We've advanced our technology infinitely, but the baseline condition of the human heart outside of Eden remains exactly the same. We are brilliant, and we are deeply, profoundly broken.
Which perfectly sets the stage for where we're going next time. In our next deep dive, we're moving into Genesis chapters 5 and 6.
And the pace of the narrative is going to accelerate dramatically.
The family lines of Cain and Seth are going to split clearly. Humanity is going to multiply across the face of the earth exponentially. We're going to look at the life of Enoch, a man who defied the curse of death and literally walked right into God's presence. And then we're going to tackle head on one of the absolute most mysterious, heavily debated, and frankly bizarre passages in all of ancient scripture regarding the Nephilim. You will not want to miss it.
But before we go, we want to leave you with a final lingering question to mull over this week as you consider everything we discussed today.
Something to chew on.
We saw today that the lineage of the very first murderer is the exact same lineage that gave humanity its first beautiful musical instruments and its first advanced metalworking. What does it say about the human condition that our most profound artistic and technological creativity seems forever intertwined with the dark shadow of our exile from Eden? Does our relentless pursuit of technological progress today still carry that same shadow of trying to build our own paradise without God?
That is a heavy, necessary question to take with you. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive on Between the Verses, where curiosity meets scripture. We'll see you next time.